Joining us now to break this down is retired U.S. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you very much. So you've obviously had experience in the government, particularly during the Reagan administration. And now we see right now, where we see kind of a resurgence once again about talks of socialism. Do you see any type of comparisons or similarities between the two times?
Well, look, there's certainly parallels in the actions of Vladimir Putin, and obviously Ronald Reagan clearly stood against the Soviet Empire. It's because of him that the Soviet Empire came down, which Putin regards apparently as one of the worst things that ever happened in history. From my perspective, it was one of the greatest things. We went from tens of thousands of nuclear weapons down to a few thousand, and made the lives of my children and now my 18 grandchildren a whole lot safer. What I see Donald Trump doing is very Reagan-esque. He sets out very clear boundaries for the other side. He asks for verification and looks for it. If you look at what he's done in keeping his promises about ending the wars that we've been in for 2 decades, he's doing that. So I look at Donald Trump as a man who keeps his word, just like Ronald Reagan did.
And when it comes to his efforts to do so, too, in fact, a lot of the critics, especially last week, we heard once again that there's Russian interference in the 2020 elections, the same way that we heard it back in 2016 as well. But then supporters of the president will look at all of that he's done, whether it be kind of combating Iranian militants in the Middle East, whether it be kind of curbing Russia or Western Europe's dependence on Russian oil, different things like that. And they kind of say that maybe some of the criticisms are not fair. Do you think that this is a fair criticism of the president, saying that he's helping Russia, or do you think that this is once again kind of maybe more of a smear tactic used by his critics?
Well, I think I have no doubt that if the Russians could make themselves look better in one fashion or another by telling the truth or by telling lies, they would be doing so. I do not see Donald Trump doing deals with the Russians. I see what Donald Trump is doing is protecting America the right way. And so you just mentioned the fact that the Iranians are today the crazy elephant in the room, and they still are. Ronald Reagan inherited what Jimmy Carter's mess had been before him. And unfortunately, Donald Trump still has people or their holdovers from the last administration that work against him inside our government. It's very much the same kind of thing that Ronald Reagan experienced when he came to office in 1981. He was dealing with the same kinds of issues, in a different magnitude, perhaps, with the Soviet Union than Russia. And what Vladimir Putin is doing is trying to make Russia more than it is. The fact is, Vladimir Putin is governing a dying country. There are 1 million fewer Russians this year than there were last year, and there'll be 1 million fewer next year than there are now. The reality of it is, Vladimir Putin can sell the following things. Weapons, he's tried. He sells them anywhere that people will buy them, and they have to pay for them now. Number 2, exports women and exports oil and natural gas. Yeah. And now we're the best natural gas exporters in the world, and oil is not getting through from the Iranian oil fields or from Venezuela in quantities it should and could. And quite frankly, I don't see Putin being able to manage his way out of the mess that he's in economically, as well as the dying demography of the country.
No, and, you know, it's not only with Russia directly, it's also with their proxies as well. In fact, we've seen the Trump administration take a very hard stance when it comes to the Iranian regime, but then also in Venezuela, in our own hemisphere as well. I mean, of course, the Russians were backing Venezuela, the Maduro dictatorship. We've seen this Trump administration take a very hardline approach to the way that they're acting, and in fact, going out of their way to support Juan Guaido, the opposition leader, in that effort as well. And so right now we also see the likely Democratic nominee, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but Senator Bernie Sanders. He's in the past praised the dictatorships in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, all these different countries right now. So do you think that's really going to be a big issue going into 2020, is kind of differentiating the two?
Alex, Sanders and his wife honeymooned in the Soviet Union, for crying out loud. I mean, this is a guy who, if the word weren't so unacceptable, would probably describe himself not just as a socialist, but as a communist. The fact that he's got the following he does within the Democrat Party today is frightening, because the polarization that's about to occur if it's Sanders coming up against Mr. Trump, it's going to be devastating to the political process and totally contrary to the idea that you could have a Democrat Party like you once had. Even in the days of my dad growing up saying he's a Republican going to vote for Harry Truman because Harry Truman saved my dad's life. And we didn't understand what he was talking about back in those days, 1948. But of course, it was because Harry Truman was the kind of man who would take on the responsibility of dropping the 2 bombs that ended the war and saved millions of lives by doing so. I don't see a Democrat Party like that anymore.
Yeah, and I think that does speak to something, too, because we wouldn't be talking about Senator Sanders in the position he is if there wasn't a pretty big level of support coming behind him, especially among the youth populations. Yeah. It's very much so a younger type of generation type thing where they are kind of more prone or more willing to give into socialistic type of policies. And you recently wrote a book, too, called The Rifleman, which focuses on the very beginning of the U.S. history, the founding fathers, if you will, and kind of the U.S. Revolution. Do you think that part of that is because that a lot of the modern day millennials or the youth right now have kind of lost sight about what it meant to be the original U.S., what the Constitution and what the founding fathers had in mind?
Well, yeah, look, I've got, like I said, I have 18 grandkids. They span from a sophomore in college to 5 months old. Mm-hmm. And I see what they're taught in public schools today, and it's frightening. And what they're not taught is what created this country and makes us unique on the planet Earth. There's no other country that begins with the words, "we the people," in their Constitution. There's no other country that recognizes the role of the Creator and the Savior of the world, like our Constitution. It's unique on the planet Earth, both our Declaration and our Constitution, and our kids are not being taught that kind of thing today. They don't see it in the media. It's not reported in terms of what's really happening. Look at how long it took to explain things to young people today about what President Trump just went through with this impeachment process. There were people on air saying, and I heard it on different networks, not yours and not the one I used to work for, but others, where the reporters did not know that it took a 2/3 vote in the United States Senate to remove the President of the United States. They thought it was going to be a majority vote, for crying out loud. So the knowledge of what made our country great is the reason I wrote that book, The Rifleman. Daniel Morgan would have been one of my neighbors out in the Shenandoah River Valley. And Daniel Morgan's words weren't nearly as important as what Daniel Morgan did and what the founders did afterwards, declaring independence in 1776 from the most powerful nation on the planet Earth. Right. And then building an alliance with the French, which nobody thought you could do. And then defeating that great power at Yorktown in 1781. Those are the kinds of things that inspired me. I wrote that book so my grandkids would know it.
Yeah. No, and I think that it's knowing our history is very important to directing where we go as forward as well. And I think to your point, too, regarding the impeachment talk, a lot of people in the media haven't learned the lesson from 2016, and it looks like they're on pace to kind of repeat the same mistakes going into 2020. But Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North,
I think you're
really appreciate
right.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting point and a good one to end on. Yeah. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Semper Fi.